At a quiet excavation site beside the pyramids, archaeologists brush away sand, revealing a human skeleton buried just meters from the monument itself. The bones are not hidden far away, but placed deliberately near one of the most powerful structures ever built, in a position that suggests recognition rather than neglect. For generations, people have believed the pyramids were built by slaves, forced into labor and erased from history, their lives reduced to nothing more than suffering. But this burial tells a different story, because slaves were not honored in death, and they were not placed so close to the legacy of a king. As more graves emerge from the sand, a pattern begins to appear, revealing organization, intention, and a level of care that challenges everything we thought we knew. And that raises a question that changes the entire meaning of the pyramids. If the workers were not slaves, then why did they build them? Because what we're about to uncover is not a story about slaves at all, but about a system powerful enough to shape an entire civilization. The idea that slaves built the pyramids comes from stories written long after they were finished, most famously by Herodotus nearly 2,000 years later. His account described massive forced labor, and over time that version of history became the one repeated in books, films, and popular imagination. But archaeology does not deal in stories, it deals in evidence, and what has been found at Giza does not match the image of a broken, enslaved workforce. Instead of chains or mass graves, researchers uncovered structured burial sites, organized settlements, and signs of a workforce that was managed with purpose. Each new excavation reveals another carefully placed grave, reinforcing the idea that these individuals were not treated as disposable labor. Evidence suggests that most of the workers were part of a rotating labor system, tied to the rhythms of Egyptian life, rather than permanent forced servitude. And once that assumption begins to fall apart, the pyramids stop looking like a symbol of oppression and start looking like something far more complex. As archaeologists continued to study the site, a clearer picture emerged, showing that the people behind the pyramids were not faceless laborers, but individuals with defined roles and identities. Many of them were farmers who came to Giza when the Nile River flooded, a time when their fields were underwater and agricultural work temporarily stopped. Others were skilled workers, including stonecutters, transport specialists, and organizers, forming teams that operated with structure and coordination rather than chaos. Some of these teams even left behind graffiti inside the pyramids, with names that suggest pride and identity rather than anonymity or forced obedience. This kind of organization changes how we see them, because it suggests they were part of a system that recognized their role, not one that erased them. And when you begin to see the workers as people with purpose, the pyramids stop being a mystery of labor and start becoming a story about human participation. Which leads to a deeper question, because if they had roles, structure, and identity, then what kind of system was powerful enough to bring all of that together? What makes this picture even more surprising is not just who the workers were, but how they actually lived while building one of the largest structures in history. Excavations revealed large bakeries and breweries capable of producing food at scale, suggesting that feeding the workforce was a central part of the entire operation. Bread and beer formed the foundation of their daily diet, supplied in consistent quantities to sustain thousands of people working under harsh desert conditions. Animal remains found at the site show regular consumption of meat, including cattle, a resource that was considered valuable in ancient Egyptian society. This level of provisioning was not accidental. It required planning, coordination, and a system capable of maintaining stability over long periods of time. It also suggests that working on the pyramids may have offered something in return, whether it was food security, social identity, or a place within a larger structure. And as that system becomes clearer, the pyramids begin to look less like a mystery of labor and more like the result of a society that knew exactly how to organize itself. At this point, the story begins to shift, because the pyramids were not simply built by workers, but by a system that extended far beyond the construction site itself. The scale of organization required meant that food, labor, materials, and timing all had to be coordinated across an entire kingdom, not just a single location. One of the key forces behind this system was the cycle of the Nile River, which shaped both the economy and the availability of labor. When the Nile flooded, farmland became temporarily unusable, creating a window where large numbers of people could be mobilized for state projects. This allowed the Egyptian state to redirect energy that would otherwise be lost, turning seasonal disruption into one of the most ambitious construction efforts in human history. What looks like a monument rising from the desert is actually the visible result of invisible systems, moving people, resources, and time in precise coordination. And once you see that system in motion, the pyramids stop being just a question of labor and become a question of how an entire civilization was organized to make them possible. To understand why they built the pyramids, you have to step into a worldview where politics, religion, and survival were not separate, but deeply connected. The pharaoh, like Khufu, was not simply a ruler, but a central figure believed to maintain order between the human world and the divine. Building his pyramid was not just about honoring a king, it was about preserving Ma'at, the balance that kept society stable and the universe in harmony. Within that belief system, participating in such a project was not meaningless labor, but part of maintaining a reality that people depended on. At the same time, the state provided structure, resources, and coordination, turning that belief into organized action on a massive scale. This combination of faith and control created a system where people were not only directed to build, but also understood why it mattered. And in that understanding, the pyramids become more than stone. They become the physical expression of how an entire civilization saw its place in the world. But even within this organized system, the work itself was physically demanding, requiring constant effort to move, shape, and position massive stone blocks under extreme conditions. The human body leaves its own record, and skeletal remains show signs of long-term strain, including worn joints and healed injuries from repeated physical stress. This was not effortless participation in a grand vision, but a life defined by endurance, repetition, and the limits of the human body. Tools left behind in work areas show moments where activity slowed, paused, or simply reached the point where people needed to stop. So while the system provided structure and meaning, it also demanded a cost that was carried by the people who did the work. The pyramids, when seen this way, are not just monuments of ambition, but records of the physical effort required to make that ambition real. And in that effort, you begin to see the workers not as part of a system alone, but as individuals whose lives were shaped by the weight of what they built. What remains today is not just a monument of stone, but the physical trace of lives that were once part of something much larger than themselves. The evidence left behind does not tell a story of anonymous suffering, but of people who lived, worked, and existed within a system that shaped their roles. These workers were not kings, and most of their names are lost, but their presence is still embedded in every layer of the pyramids. And in that sense, the pyramids are not only about power or legacy, but about how ordinary lives became part of something that outlasted them by thousands of years. When you look at the pyramids now, you are not just seeing a structure. You are seeing the result of choices, beliefs, and systems that came together in a single form, which changes the way we understand them, because they are no longer distant wonders, but the outcome of a civilization organizing itself around a shared purpose. The pyramids were never just built by slaves, and they were never just tombs, but the result of a system that brought together belief, power, and human effort. What stands at Giza is not only a monument to a ruler like Khufu, but a record of the thousands of lives that made his vision possible. Their names may be gone, But their work was not meaningless, because it shaped one of the most enduring structures ever created by human hands. And in that sense, the pyramids are not just about the past, but about what happens when a society aligns its people, its resources, and its beliefs toward a single goal. But even if we now understand why they were built, one question still remains, because belief alone cannot explain how millions of stones were actually moved and placed. And that is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because the real mystery is not who built the pyramids, but how they did it.